Okay, so it looks like people are starting to join. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes just to make sure that everyone gets on before we properly start. So maybe just give people, and it looks like the numbers not going up as much, but we'll maybe just wait another minute and then we can make a start, and people can keep, if people join a couple of minutes later, it won't matter. Okay, I think that's, well, I just make a start because we're a few minutes past 7 now. So if more people come, that's fine. So I'll just start off by saying thank you everyone for joining us for this evening's webinar on Squirrelpox in the Central Lowlands. My name is Jill Hatcher and I'm the Communications and Engagement Officer for Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels. And one of the many aims of the Developing Community Action Project was to raise awareness amongst landowners about the eventual spread of squirrelpox to this part of the country. So we've been wanting to do an event like this for quite a while now, and it's great that it's finally happening this evening. So the purpose of this webinar is not to raise the alarm, it's simply to help make people aware that squirrelpox is gradually making its way north from Dumfries and Galloway and the Scottish borders, and we wanted to just let you all know in a little bit more detail what that actually means and how you could potentially play a part in helping manage the spread in the future. Now, unfortunately, our Tayside Conservation Officer, Anne-Marie, wasn't able to make it here this evening, so she sends her apologies, but the good news is we're still going to have 3 presentations. So our project manager, Mel Tonkin, is going to start us off, followed by our guest speaker tonight, who is Professor Elspeth Milne from the Royal Dick Veterinary School in Edinburgh. Then we're just going to have a little 10-minute break, and then when we get back, our conservation officer for Argyll, the Trossachs and Stirlingshire, Mary Ann, she's going to talk a little bit about how you can get involved, and then we'll open it up to questions. So you can ask questions at any time throughout the event via the Q&A bar, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer them all, but we will finish by 8:30 at the latest. And then the other thing I should let you know is that we are recording the webinar so that we can make it available for others to view at tomorrow's knowledge fair, which hopefully quite a few of you are also going to be attending, but I'll give you a little bit more detail about that at the end of the event. So I think that's all for me, and I'll just hand over to Mel now. So if Mel, you want to share your screen, we can get started.
I think we have sharing at this point. As Jill said, I'm Mel Tonkin. I'm the Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels project manager. And I've been in this post since about 2009 when we started. So I've been around a long time. So this evening I thought what would be helpful would be to give you a bit of a background in the history of squirrelpox in the UK, but mostly in Scotland, and to give you a bit of a rundown on what we've been trying to do to combat it and where we're up to now in the Central Lowlands. So, so it's a rush through the history, hopefully not too rushed. I'm sure you're all aware of the conservation problem for red squirrels, this catastrophic loss of red squirrels as grey squirrels expanded their range. And this has happened, really quite dramatically. So it took people by surprise. We thought we were going to have lovely additional grey squirrels in our fauna, but in fact, it turns out they replace our red squirrels. So looking a little bit more at the situation in Scotland. So in particular, looking at a couple of decades before we started Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels, what we are seeing in these shots, what we've got is red squirrels are showing in their red color, so that where there's just red squirrels. Where there's both species of squirrels, we're seeing the sort of pinky color, pinky purpley color, and where you're seeing the gray blocks, it's just gray squirrels. And you can see that in the 1990s, red squirrels could be found in pretty much every 10-kilometer square. That's what these squares are on the maps. Everywhere in Scotland, so pretty much anywhere you went, you could find a red squirrel within that kilometer square. But by the time we get into the 2000s, we're seeing a big span across the central belt there that we're just seeing grey squirrels, and the red squirrels have disappeared from those squares. We're also seeing a big expansion of the grey squirrel range in the Dumfries and Galloway area, and this population centred on Aberdeen has really consolidated and started to spread as well. So the spread was very much ongoing at the time when Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels came about. So the mechanism for the replacement of red squirrels by greys in Scotland has, for the most part, been by competition, just pure competition for food and for living space, and grey squirrels outcompete reds, and it's as simple as that. Until 2005, that is. Now, at 2005, we get the first instance of squirrelpox being found in a grey squirrel in Scotland, right down on the Cumbrian border. So now we have a situation where it's disease-mediated competition. We've not just got the competition for food and habitat, we've also got a disease. And scientists have looked at this, and they've calculated that the rate of replacement of reds by greys can be sped up by as much as 25 times as soon as those greys are carrying squirrelpox. So, it is quite a dramatic addition to the risks for red squirrels. Going backwards. Why are we going backwards? Let's try going forward. So what is squirrelpox? Well, it's a virus that occurs naturally in grey squirrels. People are probably familiar by now with coronavirus, which appears to have come from bat populations, which seem to live with it without any disease symptoms at all. But it's only when it really crossed into human populations that we begin to see this catastrophic disease in the humans. And the same thing really applies to the grey squirrels. It's a natural virus for grey squirrels. It's found in some of the populations in North America, for instance. But as soon as it crosses into red squirrels, it's pretty much lethal. Most of the squirrels that catch it will die. Not every one, and that's important, but most of them do. So what we find with once it's in the red squirrels, you get these horrible pustules with discharge around the eyes and mouth and feet and genitalia, wet sort of oozing lesions and skin ulcers and scabs, as you can see from these images. And generally, the squirrel becomes lethargic, and that increases over the period. And they're usually dead within about 2 weeks, roughly speaking, of contracting the virus. So where did the squirrelpox virus come from? Well, I've already said it came from grey squirrels that were introduced from America, but not every grey squirrel that was introduced into Britain was carrying the virus. So it turns out the ones that were introduced to Scotland weren't carrying the virus, so they were squirrelpox free. Now, it was recognized really from quite early on, after grey squirrels were introduced, that they began to replace red squirrels locally, and it was quite often accompanied by disease outbreaks that looked very much like what we now know as squirrelpox. But then quite a lot of other things also looked like squirrelpox, and Elspeth will tell you a little bit more about some of those and how to recognize when you've got squirrelpox. But it's not as simple as you'd like it to be, unfortunately. So the disease really starts mainly in the south of England, and I would say we didn't actually recognize what it was at first. It took until maybe the 1970s, sort of early 1980s, before the actual virus was characterized, and subsequent research showed that this was the causative organism. If you gave it to red squirrels, they would develop squirrelpox. So in the meantime, more research has been done, and the Modern Research Institute developed a specific test for the antibodies within grey squirrels. And as we in Scotland saw the disease spreading more or less south to north, it's not quite as simple as that, but we knew it would finally get to the Scottish border at some point. So antibody testing began, I mean, I think I say here in 2001, but I think actually a few people were already testing in 1999, a couple of years earlier, across the south of Scotland, so that they could pick up the early signs of disease arriving in grey squirrels. And to do that, people were taking bloods from grey squirrels that they'd killed and sending them off to the Modern Research Institute for testing. And as you can see from this slide, the first positive turns up in a grey squirrel. The blue dots are where testing has happened, but the squirrels have come back as negative for squirrelpox. And the red dots along the border with England there are where the squirrels have reacted as positive for the squirrelpox test. So the first ones turn up around about Canonbie, right on the border with Cumbria. And it starts to spread through the grey squirrel populations, kind of along the woodland valleys. So let me just try and move my toolbar out of the way here from my screen, otherwise I can't see what I'm doing. So in 2005, this is what we've got. It's in these places down here on the border. Okay, I've done something with my screen here, which I need to stop doing. What have I done? Mouse. Let's go mouse. That's better. Okay, I'm failing to manage to, couldn't get it to move on to 2006. So 2006 already we're seeing it spread further up these river valleys. This is the River Liddle, the River Esk, and it's leapt across here to the River Annan. 2007, further up those valleys. And this is where we're first seeing this triangular red triangle is where we're first seeing disease outbreaks in red squirrels. So that's happening. The first ones in Lockerbie in 2007. 2008, we're getting a great big leap across to the Nith Valley, seemingly across loads of habitat where there are no grey squirrels or they're testing negative. So this is at Thornhill. And you can, sorry about the change in mapping, but you can see that at Thornhill, it's quite a big outbreak. I think we lost between 30 and 40 squirrels in that outbreak that we found, that is. So there were bound to have been more of them, that we didn't find that died in their drays and what have you. So 2010, now in 2010, we're first seeing the squirrelpox turning up on the border just to the south of the Tweed in Northumberland. So it's coming up now on the eastern side of the country as well as the west. 2011, by this time, we're seeing the first outbreaks in red squirrels on our side of the border, and obviously the disease has started to move further north into Berwickshire now. We're also seeing it right up in Ayrshire on the west side of the country. So it's moving quite quickly. 2012, again, it's consolidating its range here. So what were we doing at the time? Well, at the time, the project in the south was called Red Squirrels in South Scotland, and it's been running from about 2001, I think they were set up. And they started to, first of all, to coordinate this squirrelpox sampling so that the projects would be aware of when squirrelpox first arrived in Scotland. And they set up these areas, specific areas in which they would do squirrelpox testing. And you can see the direction of spread and where these arrows are. Now, until about 2011, the sampling that was done, the squirrelpox sampling that was done, was very little further ahead than, it was just ahead of the disease spread. So generally speaking, by the time we had got the test results back, the disease had probably already caught up with where we were testing. So at this point, we decided, well, we'll change the way we do this. Instead of just getting sporadic testing from wherever we could across the disease front, we'd now start to test right across the grey squirrel population in Scotland, so right up to the Highland Line, which are these sort of northernmost squares. And what we did was to try and sample at roughly regular intervals across the geographic landscape. These big squares are 20k squares. So what the idea was that we would choose one 10k square from those from the 4 within the 20k square and test in there. Sometimes we've tested more, obviously more squares than that. And the idea was that in those squares we would get a minimum of 10 blood samples, if we could, that is. Sometimes there weren't any squirrels, so you couldn't get any blood samples, but you can assume no squirrelpox in those circumstances. If we found a sample that tested positive, we would go back into the same population and then try and collect 40 more pox samples so that we could get a much better idea of the prevalence of the disease within any particular grey squirrel population. And this map on the right is showing the level of prevalence. So the darker the red, the greater the prevalence in that particular 10-kilometre square. And as you go towards yellow, it becomes, I think, down to this one in the central lowlands here is but less than 10% of the grey squirrel population, and it goes right up to sort of nearly 100% in some of the squares down on the border there. So in 2013, Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels, which had also been running and not having to bother about pox at that point, decided we would merge with the Red Squirrels in South Scotland project. So they now merge and they come under the same banner from 2013 onwards. Now, what we're finding is that, I'll just go back a bit if I can. What we're finding is that the disease has spread despite a lot of the control that we've put in place to try and stop it and contain it. The disease has spread from the border to the central lowlands up here in the space of 8 years. Now, that's quite a rapid spread, and I think probably happened a lot more quickly than anybody really thought it would. But in the meantime, we've had important learnings. All sorts of lessons have been learned from the work that's been going on, both within South Scotland and from elsewhere in Britain. So from our own observations, it was clear that whilst grey squirrel control had slowed the rate of squirrelpox virus spread through the grey squirrel population, we couldn't stop it altogether. It had really outflanked us and got to the further north than we really wanted it to go. And this was corroborated by mathematical modelling data that compared the spread of pox with grey squirrel control and without grey squirrel control. done by Andy White and Peter Lertz. And they confirmed that the control had slowed the spread of pox, but was never really going to actually stop it from spreading throughout Scotland's grey squirrel population. However, importantly, what we were finding was that where we'd been doing all this control in an attempt to slow the rate of pox spread or stop the rate of pox spread, we found that red squirrels were thriving in these landscapes. So where we'd got this coordinated, sustained grey squirrel control, red squirrels were not just surviving, they were thriving. They were doing better than before control came along and before the pox came along. Even where squirrelpox is endemic in the grey squirrels that they were sharing the habitat with. So what we find is that if red squirrels did die out, as they did, in quite a catastrophic way at Thornhill in 2007 there, if you can prevent grey squirrels from building up numbers and taking over where they find a vacancy in the habitat, you leave that habitat vacant for red squirrels to recover into. And this is what we were finding. We were finding that there's no need to lose your entire red squirrel population as long as you're able to put this coordinated and sustained grey squirrel control in place. And then a couple of other things from squirrelpox research elsewhere in the UK. Some of this comes from the Isle of Anglesey in Wales, which was cleared of grey squirrels over quite a long period of time. We found that squirrelpox virus doesn't tend to spread very rapidly within red squirrel populations. And what we think is that once it gets into red squirrel populations, the animals become diseased, and the onset of symptoms is so rapid that the virus only transmits to local squirrels. Within 2 weeks, the squirrels have stayed in their drays and have died. So they haven't got a lot of time to pass the disease on. Whereas we know that grey squirrels are shedding virus for, I think one of the pieces of research said about something like 14 weeks after they've started to shed it. So it's quite a long time that they're shedding it for. So that's useful to know that, should the disease ever reach the Highland Line, where the north of which we've just got red squirrels, the likelihood is it's not going to travel very far as long as we prevent grey squirrels from moving into spaces that are left by red squirrels. Another interesting finding from Anglesey was that where grey squirrel densities are kept very low, the squirrelpox disease doesn't circulate very freely. Presumably because there are too few susceptible animals, who haven't built up a resistance, an antibody resistance to the disease. There are too few susceptible animals to keep that infection cycle active. So, and sometimes the disease can die out, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. Now, I mentioned that we had this kind of landscape scale monitoring scheme. From 2015 onwards, it became clear that for most of the grey squirrel populations in South Scotland, we're going to have some level of squirrelpox present. So we thought, well, there's no point testing anymore because we know what the answer is going to be. So we restricted our tests to these squares that from Edinburgh, Glasgow northwards. And the aim was that if we could detect early on that the squirrelpox was spreading to the grey squirrel population, people could get containment measures in place by managing the grey squirrels locally, if they wanted to try and protect their local red squirrel populations. Now, I thought it might be helpful at this point to just look at what the strategic aims of the Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels Grey Squirrel Control Programme is altogether. So 2 priorities. One is to try and protect this big red-only population that is centred on the Highlands and Grampian, Argyll, northern parts of Tayside and Stirling. And to do that, we're going to try and, initially was just to contain this population of grey squirrels. It's an isolated population based on Aberdeen, but as time has gone on, we're now aiming at eradicating it altogether because it's behind our front line there. But along the Highland Line, really all we can manage to do, because of the amount of work it takes, is to try and prevent any further incursion northwards. And where they have got northwards, like up the Tay Valley here, is to try and get rid of those squirrels and press them back down below the Highland Line. And then finally, in the south of Scotland, we were aiming at reducing grey squirrel densities to prevent replacement of reds in priority areas that we chose. So we've chosen big areas of landscape that had good red squirrel populations, already had control measures going on that was for squirrelpox management, but was obviously doing equally as well for red squirrel protection. So that's been the focus in the south there. So if we look at some of the testing results that have come back from the central lowlands from 2013 onwards, now we were testing in central lowlands from 2012 onwards. 2013, we get our first positives turn up here at a place called Pleen, which is near Bannockburn. Not very many. I think it's 2 squirrels out of 36 or something tested. It's a largish number that was tested, and a few that came back as positive, but still the nearest other positive is right across here at East Linton. So it begs the question, how did they transmit across that distance? Interesting question. I don't think we have an answer, but it is a puzzle. So in 2014, the test results come back with another positive here at Pleen again. I think again 2 squirrels were positive out of a largish sample. We're also seeing down here probably near Pennycook. So this is probably actually the Morden Research Institute who does our testing for us, testing for themselves down there, just testing their local squirrels to test their ELISA test that they do, just to make sure it's working well. And obviously it is, because they've come back positive. 2015, Pleen again, and the Morden Research Institute again. But also now we're looking at a place in Bear's Den on the River Kelvin, where it's suddenly turned up. Again, not many squirrels out of a larger sample. 2016, we didn't get it from Pleen. I don't think we tested huge numbers of animals, but we didn't find it at Pleen, and we didn't find it at Bear's Den. But now we're finding it at Erskine Bridge. Again, a couple of squirrels in a larger sample. And we're also finding this rather odd positive result come back from the southwest corner of Loch Lomond. And this is an odd one because we only caught 2 squirrels in that area for the whole year, despite a lot of trapping that went on. Particularly after we'd got the positive result, we trapped and trapped and trapped, and we only found 1 more squirrel, and it was negative. So that's a bit of an odd one, that on its own, it's sustained this disease. So presumably it has actually somehow managed to cross over, or it's just possible there's a cross reactivity with some other virus in the environment that isn't squirrelpox. So there is that possibility. So in 2017, we've got another positive come out of the square that Pleen is in. So not actually at Pleen in this case, but not too far away. 2018, back at Erskine Bridge again, or the river at Erskine, just on the south end of Erskine Bridge. In 2019, an odd one from Strathallan up here. Again, we hadn't picked up any positives in the test before that, and all the testing after that, and it was only 1 squirrel. So again, there's a query over whether that's a genuine positive. In 2020, we didn't pick up anything, but it has to be said, because of COVID, we were unable to appoint our usual grey squirrel control officer, the seasonal person who does this testing around the central belt here. So we were unable to do that testing. But so far in 2021, all the tests have come back negative again. So now we're looking at 8 years from when squirrelpox first gets detected in the central lowlands at Plean in 2013 and 2021, 8 years for the south of Scotland, the disease traversed the border to the central lowlands. In the 8 years since, not a lot of movement. Now, we don't really quite know why that is. It's interesting to note, and I think probably all the same, we can expect the disease to continue to travel and spread through all of Scotland's grey squirrel populations eventually. But it's been a lot slower than we thought. I mean, we really felt that, if you remember from the very early slides, it's the central belt where grey squirrels first replace red squirrels. So we tended to think, well, they've been there longer, they've built up their numbers, surely the disease will spread quicker. But as far as we can tell, according to our testing, it hasn't. So that's been something of a surprise. I think we thought we would have to hold this meeting with you all to alert you to the presence of squirrelpox a lot earlier. And in fact, we're still not really alerting you because it's just hovering on the edge of the central lowlands. But we're getting towards the end of this 5-year phase of the project, so we felt it was time that we did at least bring this possible danger of squirrelpox arrival in the central lowlands to your attention. So just to summarize what we've found from the testing in the central lowlands, it began in 2012. The first occurrences in 2013 at Plean, very low prevalence within the squirrel population. Zero prevalence meaning the number of squirrels in the population, or the percentage of squirrels in the population that have tested positive. So it's a level of disease occurrence within a population. We found that squirrelpox hasn't spread very far over the last 8 years. We still expect that it will eventually spread through Scotland's grey squirrels, hopefully not the Aberdeen population, because there's a 30-kilometre gap between that and the nearest grey squirrels in the central lowlands. That grey squirrel control can slow the rate of squirrelpox spread. That grey squirrel control can help red squirrels to survive in landscapes even where there is squirrelpox in the grey squirrels that are around. That squirrelpox is not likely to spread very rapidly through red squirrel populations if it does get into them, as long as you prevent grey squirrels from moving in, that is. And then finally, that the disease, and I suppose a point that's part of the previous point, the disease outbreak in red squirrels burns out before it gets passed on more widely through the populations. And also that where grey squirrel densities are low, the disease doesn't seem to circulate freely and can die out. And that's what seems to have happened in the central belt there, where we had positives and now are not getting positives. But it could all just be a matter of time before it all explodes again. And I think that probably brings us up to where we are. And then I'm going to hand over to Elspeth, who's going to tell you a bit more about the testing and how that works, and how to get a good blood sample, and maybe a little bit about other diseases that squirrels get that may look a bit like squirrelpox and how you know what you've got. At least I think that's what she's going to talk about. So finally, thank you to the Morden Research Institute for carrying out all our squirrelpox testing, to the Royal Dick School of Veterinary Studies for the postmortems that they carry out on any red squirrel carcasses that we collect, to the Animal and Plant Health Agency for confirming using electron microscopy or PCR testing, which some people will be familiar with now after COVID, for confirming that it is actually squirrelpox that is found as the virus is found in those carcasses that have been confirmed by post-mortem as being dead of squirrelpox. And finally, a big thank you to all the people over the years who have taken the trouble to collect blood samples and send them in for testing. We couldn't do this kind of surveillance without you, and I'm sure that there'll be some of you there in this audience, without you taking the trouble to do this. I know it's sort of an extra thing that you've got to do when you control grey squirrels, and so a big thank you to you.
Right, thanks very much, Mel. I'll see if I can share my screen now. Hopefully. Okay, hopefully everybody can see the screen now. Please let me know if not. So thanks very much for inviting me to come along today. I'm pleased to be able to talk a little bit about our disease surveillance that we've been running for red squirrels, which started in 2005. Based at the University of Edinburgh, and we work just at Easter Bush campus, just south of Edinburgh. So I thought I'd like to just introduce who actually does the work with the red squirrels. So my colleagues here, well, there's myself, there's my colleague Liam Wilson, who's a pathologist as well. And he's also doing some research into red squirrels. And then Chandra Logie, who's our postmortem room technician, she does all the preparing and looking after the samples, maintaining the banks that we have of bodies within the freezers, and she also does postmortems herself as well. So it's just a little team of three really that's doing the work. So I thought what I would do is just explain what we actually do and what use we've made over the of these bodies that we get in for postmortem, how valuable this has actually been. So I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with these forms that are available on the SSRS website. And this gives some quite useful, just some practicalities to explain first of all. This gives some quite useful information, I think, about how to send squirrels in for postmortem examination, where to send them, and also how to package them, which is very important because we don't want to fall foul of any of the regulations with respect to sending in bodies. So if you've not seen this already, then have a look at it, and it's got contact numbers and so on there as well. One thing not to do is to address them to me personally, because sometimes there's a bit of a danger of them ending up in my pigeonhole and possibly being there for a while if I happen to be away, which is not ideal. So you've probably also seen these forms that you can send in with the squirrels. And this is a bit small perhaps for you to read, but it doesn't really matter. That try to fill it in as best you can. That's always gives us the most amount of information that we can get. The more the better, really. But very importantly is the first bit where when you found the squirrel and the actual location where it was found. So if you can provide a grid reference, that's excellent. Somebody last week for the first time used the 3 words app, and that worked really well because I was able to find out the grid reference by using those 3 words that they provided. But as much information as you can. And we always like to keep contact with the people who send the squirrels in. So if you want to get the postmortem report, then please put your email address on the form as well, and we'll send you the report. And we always copy in the regional conservation officers as well. So when we do postmortems, we always do them to the 3 of us, but also it means that we're collecting the correct information every time, as far as we possibly can. Obviously, sometimes there's some deficiencies, like bits of squirrels missing because of predation or or perhaps due to the bodies not being in such good condition as they might be if they're starting to decompose a bit. But we always try to get as much as we possibly can out of this. So we go through this pro forma, if you like, and record all this information. And we have a big spreadsheet which Liam has been working on to record all that. And we also collect a series of specific samples, and just depending really on what projects are going on at the time, we collect these, and these are stored very carefully in various parts of the building, depending on what is required and the temperature that's required to store them. But notwithstanding that, these specific bits that we're collecting every time, we're also keeping the bodies so that these are all refrozen and kept in big freezers, so that if there are other projects going on, we can liaise with researchers who might be interested, and we can supply other parts as they require. So just to go on to the type of information that we can get from the postmortems, and I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail of the actual findings here, but I just want to give you really a flavour for the type of information that we're able to collect. So the Forestry and Land Scotland, and we've superimposed on top of that the red squirrel postmortems. In this particular map, we've got 2010 to 2020, but we do have information going right back to 2005. And you can see that this map has got the red squirrel strongholds on it in red, the buffer zone in, or two buffer zones really, in blue, and then the top of that map we have superimposed the squirrel postmortems that we've received. So this is just the actual numbers of postmortems and where they've actually come from. And you can see that a lot of them are in the southwest, as you would imagine, and also a fair number in the northeast as well, especially in the sort of Tayside area and Aberdeenshire. Not quite so many further west. And then the same map, just with the squirrelpox cases that have been superimposed on these areas. And again, you can see that we've got good information there as to where these are occurring, where we've detected them anyway, and actually quite close there to the indicative buffer line as well, which have occurred more recently. Oops, excuse me, pressing the wrong thing. In addition to that, we always try to make a post-mortem diagnosis if we possibly can do. I mean, sometimes it's difficult to say what the cause of death was, and we don't have a whole lot of finances that, to back us up in order to go into a huge amount of kind of microscopic detail. Evident what the cause of death is likely to have been. So we have a number of categories that we put them into, and you can see there that I don't expect you to be able to see all the colours and so on. That wasn't really the point, but you can see that trauma, in other words, mainly road traffic accidents, form quite a large number of these, and that's the kind of orangey colour there scattered across. But even if they are road traffic accidents, it doesn't, they're still valuable to us because they're useful to be able to show where there isn't squirrelpox. And earlier in the year, we did actually have a road traffic accident case which had squirrelpox as well as being killed by a car. So it's all useful information. But we've got a variety of other categories, as you can see there: parasites, enteritis, leprosy, pneumonia, and then squirrelpox, of course, as well. And I'll show you pictures of some of these things just later on, just out of interest, really. Yeah, so just going on to squirrelpox disease, as Mel mentioned, 2007 was the first year that we actually saw clinical cases of it, you know, but were actually disease cases in Scotland. And the skin lesions, it takes about 10 days for these to develop, we think, after infection. And doing a large number of these postmortems, we've never really found any internal lesions. Seems to be very much just affecting the skin itself in terms of the lesions. But having said that, we have been able to detect virus in quite a number of different sites internally, obviously in the skin, but we also see it in the lining of the mouth. We see it on the tongue, and also in the lymphoid tissues, which are those around the mouth and the throat. Just some more images of squirrelpox. The typical kind of scabby lesions that we see. These are particularly severe cases, but you can see the scabs there around the eyes, chin, nose, perhaps on the ear there, and also on the feet, which is very typical. And sometimes the lesions are so deep that you can actually see muscle and tendons and so on through the skin, or it may be completely eroded off, which is pretty horrendous, really. It must be very unpleasant for the squirrels. But the other site where we see lesions quite commonly is in the axilla area here, the armpit sort of area, and also in the groin. And for some reason that it quite often is just kind of in a line like that, it may not affect the other side, as you can see here, which is virtually unaffected on the right side of the squirrel. Also on the back of the hind legs quite often, and also on the soles of the feet here as well. Sometimes on the scrotum, although that's not the case here. And actually you can see a bit of a lesion there just on the base of the tail underneath it there as well. So it can be very extensive, but other times they're quite subtle, and we're sometimes kind of wondering whether we've actually got squirrelpox or not. We have to check it out just to make sure that we're not missing one. If in doubt, we always send the samples off. So how do we know that they've actually got squirrelpox? Well, there are some changes that you can see in the skin, and this is an image of a section of skin, microscopic section of skin of a squirrelpox case. On the top here, where that sort of pink bit there, that's the surface of the skin, where we've got the keratin flakes, you know, just the sort of flakes on the surface of the skin, like we all have here. And then the deeper layers going down towards the bottom of the picture. And this is the epidermis, or the kind of outer layer here. And you can see on the right-hand side, I've just shown an arrow there to highlight it, but you can see these kind of ballooned cells, which have got sort of clear bits in them there. That's quite typical of squirrelpox and other pox type diseases as well, that we see these changes. But this is all well and good. We can see that on microscopy, but that doesn't actually prove to us beyond doubt that this is squirrelpox. So it's not a way that we would normally use to actually prove the presence of squirrelpox. So this is what we do at the moment. We send samples off to David Everest at APHA down south at Weybridge, and he does electron microscopy, extremely high magnification microscopy. We send scabs off to him or pieces of skin, and he will do this usually with a very quick turnaround of just a few days. And you can see the virus particles there. There's 3 in this image, as you can see, and they have this appearance of a kind of ball of wool, typical appearance of a pox virus particle. So when he picks these up, we can say for sure that this is going to be squirrelpox. More recently, as Mel was saying, we don't really need to explain what PCR is now these days, but this is a more sensitive test, and David has more recently started doing this, and I think it's good to be able to do both tests actually. As I say, much more sensitive in picking it up because we're multiplying up the DNA from the virus and then proving that that is present. So that's the two ways in which we prove squirrelpox at the moment. So just to show you perhaps some pictures of other skin conditions that we have to distinguish from squirrelpox infection. The first one perhaps to mention is leprosy. So leprosy in red squirrels was first noticed in the 1970s, and it was first recorded in Brownsea Island, which I think is off Dorset, right down off the south coast of England. And it's quite a common disease amongst the population there, in actual fact. And as I say, it's been there for quite a long time now, many decades really. But it was then noticed that it was present in other sites, and it was first found in Scotland around about 2006. And between 2006 and 2013, there were 6 cases reported of leprosy in red squirrels, which is quite a small number when you think about it. And then later on, 2014, it was identified that it was a type of leprosy bacterium that was causing it. It was also recorded then on the Isle of Wight. And since then, it's been recorded sporadically in a number of parts of Scotland and Ireland and England as well. But it doesn't seem to be a terribly contagious condition. It doesn't seem to cause, like massive outbreaks or anything like that. It's more sporadic, really, smaller numbers in localized areas sometimes. So just to show you lesions of leprosy, and I'm indebted to my colleague Anna Cattery, who did her PhD on leprosy. These are mild lesions, and you can see these kind of swollen, often roundish initially, swollen kind of lesions round about the ears of these squirrels. This one on the kind of heel, if you like, there, but relatively kind of localized on the squirrel. More severe lesions, they just get larger, thicker. You can get ulcerated areas occurring, and they can get extremely thick. You can get these kind of lumpy sort of lesions like this round about the face, but they can be quite extensive across other parts of the body as well. This is possibly the worst affected case that we've ever had in the post-mortem room, and you can see this extreme thickening of the skin on the nose here on the left, and then the really thick ears and round the nose, round the eyes there as well. If you see a squirrel which is as badly affected as that, the chances are that it's quite an old squirrel, because it progresses quite slowly usually, and it takes quite a long time for these lesions to build up and get thicker and thicker. So a really badly affected one, the chances are it's going to die probably of something, or possibly of something else in the near future anyway, because it'll be getting towards the end of its life in any case. So some other things that we see very commonly affecting the skin, abscesses are very common. You can see this quite large abscess on the cheek of a squirrel there before we cut into it. And here we've got a live squirrel somebody sent in a picture of, which has got some kind of infected wound, or that's certainly what it looks like, just on the side of the head there. So these kind of fighting wounds and so on are extremely common. And sometimes, I mean, especially this one on the right there, the person that sent it in wanted to be sure that that wasn't squirrelpox. So, it is something that we have to try and distinguish sometimes from squirrelpox. Parasites of the skin, ectoparasites, extremely common, and we quite often see these lice and fleas actually in these young squirrels, as they can actually cause fatalities. Because they take in so much blood that the animal becomes very anemic. And these poor little squirrels, the little carcasses are just white. They're just bled dry really by these parasites. So while a lot of squirrels have parasites, it's not, you know, so common for them to be killing them, but we do get these from time to time. Another thing that we have to distinguish from squirrelpox is these odd molting patterns that we sometimes see. And there's just a couple of examples that people have sent in. You can see the just kind of patchy sort of loss of hair there, which can look a bit odd and a bit alarming sometimes as well. But you can see both these squirrels, certainly the one on the right looks quite happy, looks like that. So just really to finish off, I thought it might be interesting just generally for people to know what, or get some examples of the kind of diseases that we see in the surveillance postmortems, other diseases that is. So pneumonia, that's quite a common cause of death. You can see a little pair of lungs here. And then we've got the heart here just at the top. So you can see my mouse there. And the part of the lung that is affected by the pneumonia is the kind of darker pink bit here. So this left lung is almost completely affected, and the right lung here, just mainly the back of the lung is affected there. And the paler bit here is and a little patch that's left there, that is the normal lung that's remaining. We have a kind of rough and ready test that we use for these, which is to take a little piece and put it in water, and if it sinks, then it's got pneumonia, and if it floats, then it's well aerated and it doesn't have pneumonia. Malocclusion of the teeth, that's quite a common thing for us to see as well. This poor squirrel, I think it had some sort of accident to its jaw, which had caused some kind of fracture, which had then re-healed, and it just became completely out of alignment. And because the squirrel's teeth are constantly growing, if they're not aligning with the top and bottom teeth are not aligning properly, then they won't wear, of course, properly either. And you can get this sort of starvation, which is a bit sad. This is quite an interesting condition that we see not uncommonly as well. Telescoping of the intestine, which is called, its kind of proper name is intussusception, but it's just really a telescoping. I suppose an analogy to it would be if you push the finger of a glove into itself, it's a similar sort of process to that. So one piece of gut gets pushed into the bit next to it. So it's kind of telescoping in. And we found through some research that we've done with David Everest at APHA that there seems to be an association with viral diarrhea in these squirrels. So it seems to be predisposed to by them having diarrhea. But whereas the diarrhea might not be fatal, the intussusceptions are fatal. This is a rather unusual thing. I've only ever seen this twice. One of them was last week, in actual fact. Very, very occasionally, these squirrels will die of blood cancer. And you can see here, hopefully anyway, this is the chin of the squirrel here, just exposed. So this is the jawline going up to, and you can see all these white lumps. And these are little bits of lymphoid tissue that would normally be like pinhead sized or even smaller than that. And here are some internal ones here as well, which are just massively increased in size, just in the sort of kidney area there. Okay, so this is a very rare thing to see in red squirrels, although it's quite common in other species like dogs and cats. But it's always quite exciting when you kind of come across something unusual like that. So, as well as the work that we're doing to kind of support the squirrelpox story, we also contribute to many other studies, and we try to make the absolute maximum out of all the samples that are sent into us. So whenever they're suitable, they go for involvement in other projects. Not only our own research, but we also collaborate with a whole variety of people across the UK, but also in other countries like Germany, for example. We did some work on adenovirus in squirrels. So these are just some examples of the sort of thing that I kind of ran out of thoughts about it when I was making this slide earlier, because there are many other things that we've also done as well. But so just for example, we've been investigating with David Everest the use of hair samples to diagnose disease, including squirrelpox, by extracting DNA from the hair bulbs, because this could be a way to sample squirrels in the environment, of course. We've done studies into squirrelpox virus transmission and grading, identification of adenovirus as a cause of diarrhea, and also to a lesser extent rotavirus. The studies on leprosy, which I mentioned already. We identified a new disease, atypical histiocytosis, and described the pathology of that. And we also worked with somebody at the University of Glasgow on tick-borne incidence of tick-borne diseases in the red squirrels that we got going through we try to make the most of these squirrels. So as well as sending in actual squirrels for post-mortem, it's always useful to see people's images. It's interesting for us, but hopefully we can help a little bit with giving some our opinions on what we think is going on. This looks a bit like a leprosy case there. Somebody took rather a good picture of. And this is the sort of thing. I'm sorry I can't acknowledge these because I kind of lost track slightly of who sent them in, but you can see the sort of images that people send, mainly wondering whether squirrelpox is present. And sometimes it's difficult for us to tell from the pictures, but other times we can say, no, that really doesn't look like squirrelpox. I wouldn't worry. It just looks like an injury or whatever. So please send these in. We're happy to do that. So just to give some acknowledgements, as Mel was saying for her talk, there's so many people involved, and we wouldn't be able to do this sort of thing without all these people. So Scottish Wildlife Trust, SSRS, the regional conservation officers like Mary Ann and Anne-Marie and Emma and so on are incredibly useful, and they're great at they send in squirrels themselves for postmortems, but they also help to coordinate the sending in of squirrels and dissemination of information and so on. So really the conservation officers have been extremely useful. Forestry and Land Scotland, the squirrel groups that are on various parts of the country, and then just ordinary members of the public that are sending them in and supporting the surveillance scheme. And also I'd like to thank my colleagues who have listed at the bottom there. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I think we're going to do that later on if I got that correct. So thanks very much, everybody.
Okay, thanks very much, Elspeth. So we're running a wee bit behind of time, but Mary Ann's talk is quite short. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take a very short comfort break for 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll come back. We'll hear what Mary Ann's got to say, and then we'll. I see we've got a few questions there in the Q&A bar, so we'll try and address as many of them as possible before 8:30. So we'll see you all back here in just 5 minutes. Okay, thank you.
Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm just going to get set up for my little bit. Give me a second and then hopefully we can get going again. And hopefully everyone can see that all right. Give me 1 second. There we go. So welcome back. So hopefully you've had a bit of a chance to kind of digest everything from Mel and Elspeth. Mine's going to be a little bit about looking towards the future and how you can help us. So as Mel's discussed, we do squirrelpox surveillance across both Tayside and the Argyll, Trossachs and Stirlingshire regions. We focus in those key grid squares which are green on this map, and the red dots are where we found squirrelpox positive results in the past couple of years. So we know that the pox is moving from South Scotland up, and thankfully it's taking a lot longer than we thought. But it will be good to put some preventative measures in place in advance of its arrival so we can try and reduce the impact in the future. So there's a couple of different ways in which you can help us with that. So the first one, which you'll probably be fed up with us saying soon, is report squirrel sightings. So keep an eye out locally, report your sightings for both red and grey squirrel, because it really does help us keep a track of where those populations are and how close they are in proximity, so we know where to target our efforts. The other thing that you can do is, if you do have visitors or other people in your local community, encourage them and talk about the project and how important it is to report their sightings. You can host a poster, you can host some of our leaflets, so please get in touch if you'd like to do any of that. We'll then have a look at red squirrels. So one of the key things is to be vigilant. So as well as reporting your sightings, keep an eye on how your squirrels are looking. If you do see a poorly red squirrel, as Elspeth said, get in touch, take a photo if you can. The photos can really help us assess the symptoms. For the most part, we tend to forward them onto Elspeth for a bit of an extra opinion. And it can help us stop the spread of disease like as soon as possible, because we know it's then in the area. If you see an animal suffering though, you should contact the SSPCA as soon as you're able to. And as Elspeth was talking about, if you find a freshly dead red squirrel, you can send it on for post-mortem. All the details are on our website. It not only helps with squirrelpox, but obviously can help with tracking lots of other diseases as well. And even if it's a road traffic accident, then we can still test it for squirrelpox and find out some other information too. And as already mentioned, those results can get sent back to you, and then the local conservation officers also copied in, so we have an idea of what's happening locally too. The other thing you can do is you can regularly clean any feeding stations that you have to try and reduce the spread of disease, not just squirrelpox, but any other diseases as well. We use the antiviral agent Vercon S. Please get in touch if you'd like to know more about where to find this. And whilst squirrelpox isn't in the area yet affecting the red squirrels, in regions where the virus is present or close by, it's in grey squirrels, we should really try and limit the amount of feeding that we're doing. If red and grey squirrels are coming to that same feeder and there is squirrelpox in greys, then we really need to stop feeding as much as possible, or at least scatter food rather than having a feeding station. In our project, especially in the south, we've been employing some emergency measures and strategies to try and kind of reduce the outbreaks, as Mel's touched on before. And therefore trying to save as many reds and maybe even help the populations flourish in those areas. Once squirrelpox does move into the central lowlands, we're going to employ very, very similar strategies. So it'd be really good if you can keep in touch with the project and share any information and guidance that we provide as quickly as possible when the time comes. Speed is a bit important in this respect, trying to get everybody to stop feeding and that sort of thing. For example, if there is evidence of disease in reds, we can put out local alerts to stop feeding and to keep an eye out for poorly looking squirrels. In the meantime, we ask you to stay in touch so that we can have an up-to-date contact list of everyone, so we can do that really quickly. You can keep an eye on our news and blog posts, also our social media channels. You can find all the links to them on our website, and you can subscribe to our quarterly newsletter too. Our regional teams are always on hand. We're always happy to discuss other bits and pieces and different squirrel-related activities with you, so please get in touch with us as well. In terms of grey squirrels, the majority of you know that we do grey squirrel targeted in many of your areas, and we tend to focus this close to red squirrel populations. This is conducted by our project staff, by volunteers, by landowners, potentially some of yourselves, and it can be done through a grant scheme from the government too. We do this by live trapping. Some of our staff can also do free shooting, but that's mainly because we're working in areas where reds and greys are quite close together. There's a couple of different ways that you can help if you're not doing so already, or you'd like to help a little bit more. So you can allow us access to control grey squirrels on your property. We do have lots of different techniques to do this. I know public perception isn't always the best, but we do have some interesting ways around that, which I will not advertise just now because otherwise it wouldn't be so secret. Also, if you're living within the Highland Line priority area of our control, then you can join our trap loan scheme. This is again with the aim of trying to keep that population of grey squirrels really, really low, to keep that habitat available for red squirrels so they can thrive, and also reduce that rate of transmission of the virus between the greys, and also so that the reds and greys don't overlap as much. If you're actually already carrying out grey squirrel control, first of all, thank you very much. If we don't know about this already, can you please let us know? It's really important that we find out exactly who's doing what where, because then we can target our efforts. We can maybe see if there's gaps, and we can try and fill those gaps with volunteers or other landowners. If you can share your control records with us, that would be great as well. We've got a couple of different ways that you can do that, so get in touch. It really helps us to understand population size to a very minimal degree. It helps us show where dispersal routes are, so we can target specific areas and reduce where those grey squirrels are coming in. We can also figure out where red squirrels are moving back into places and maybe heading towards a grey squirrel population. And it helps us understand future overlap points, so we can put things in place in advance. The other thing you could do is also help us take blood samples for the squirrelpox virus in the grey squirrels. As I mentioned, all these green squares are our kind of priority areas to keep an eye on. So if you do feel that you might be in one of those areas and you could help with that, please get in touch. You can find that in the toolkit that is also on the website that we released earlier this year. And essentially, hopefully by working together, we can all ensure that Scotland's red squirrels have a safe place to call home for a very long time into the future. That's everything from me, and I'm imagining we're opening the floor to questions. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Marianne. So if we can just get Mel and Elspeth back. So thanks all three of you for those presentations, really interesting. Wasn't expecting so much gore from Elspeth, but it was very fascinating.
Oh, sorry.
It really was. So we've got quite a few questions. We've got about 15 minutes or so to get through. We might not get through every single question, but I'll try and ask as many as I can. I'll try and kind of pick out some of the key ones here. Let's see. Okay, we'll start with a question from Hugh Rose, who's asking, how far do we think individual infected grey squirrels really travel? Obviously they can hitch a ride, but if there is endemic infection, you would think that it would be a local spread. So the question is, how far would an infected grey squirrel actually travel?
I think from the modelling work and from our own observations, the disease doesn't necessarily spread with a single animal. It's more like, if you can imagine a sound wave propagating, the molecules jiggle in place, they don't move along. It's the actual energy that moves along. And it's the same happens with the infection. Although we do know that grey squirrels can move an incredible distance if they so wish. We find them, you know, sometimes 20 kilometers out on a moor with no woodland on even. So we know that they are capable of moving a long distance. But it does seem to be much more transmitting to the next squirrel, which transmits to the next squirrel, to the next squirrel.
Okay, great. And then the next question here is from Jeremy Skuse. He's asking, given what we know about virus evolution and mutations, has squirrelpox evolved at all? And if so, how? Is it more transmissible? Is it more deadly to the host? Or does it kill its host so far that it doesn't have time to evolve?
I don't know who's the right person to answer that. I don't think we know just yet. I don't think anybody's been characterizing the viruses to that extent, as far as I'm aware, but Elspeth can maybe talk about that a little bit. But I could just say that whilst I'm not sure about the virus itself, we do know that some red squirrels have been affected by the disease and are showing antibody responses, but they're perfectly fine. For some reason, a very small number of red squirrels, we think somewhere around 8% of red squirrels, can survive infection with the disease. So it may be that over time, more and more of those squirrels will be the survivors and leading, producing their offspring, and more of them survive. So there may be a general drift in red squirrels, but for that to happen, you really need to keep on top of the grey squirrel control so that you're stopping grey squirrels just moving in and taking over anyway. So, because it's such a small number of red squirrels that do manage to survive. But I'll hand over to Elspeth to see if she knows anything more about the actual different kinds of squirrelpox.
No, not really. I don't know if I can add much to that, really. I mean, these are good questions, actually, and they're things that would be nice to know, but we just don't have a complete handle on that just now. It doesn't, I'm not sure that we could say that it kills them so quickly that it wouldn't evolve because of that, because it does take a little while before they die, and you could be talking about a couple of weeks, between becoming infected and dying. So I guess that might be time for mutations to occur, but we just don't know enough about whether they do or not. Or that, I mean, the other part of the question there, which is also a good one, is what triggers a grey to shed the virus and what might stop it. I don't suppose we could really stop it, but we just don't know what causes the trigger. Or is there a trigger? Is it just something that's kind of happening continuously anyway?
And on a kind of similar note, Ray Cox has just asked, has any work been done to create a vaccine for red squirrels that could be added to their feeders?
Yes, now some work has been done, quite extensive work has been done by the Morden Research Institute on trying to create a vaccine, and they got as far as finding 2 candidate vaccines that worked in the laboratory situation. Now the problem, there are several problems with this to get it any further. One is that in the lab situation, they were able to scarify the skin to introduce the virus vaccine into the squirrel. Now the vaccine caused a bit of a blistering of the skin, one of these ulcerative scabs, but the squirrel developed antibodies and survived. In the wild, you couldn't obviously catch up every red squirrel and scarify the skin. You'd have to find another way of introducing the vaccine. And at the moment, the oral route, trying to feed it to them in some bait, seems to be the most likely way that it can be done. And then you've got an issue, if it's going to cause scabs in the mouth, it might prevent them feeding. It might actually not be very survivable in itself. The vaccine itself, it might not be survivable by red squirrels in the wild if they're not given tender loving care would be in a veterinary laboratory. But one of the really, really big problems for squirrelpox vaccine is the difficulty, which pharmaceutical company is going to think it worthwhile to develop it and to produce it in sufficient amounts? Where people are paying for vaccine over worldwide, it's worth their while doing this. They can make a lot of money out of it, clearly. But where you're just homing in on a population here and there of red squirrels, it probably isn't worth a pharmaceutical company's time to actually just develop enough of the vaccine to make it useful. And that seems to me to be the main hurdle that we'd have to overcome. I don't know if Elspeth has anything more to add to that.
No, that's my understanding as well. No, I would agree with that.
Yeah, it's very rare what's happened in the past couple of years where a vaccine gets developed so quickly, but it's not, especially for one which is for squirrels, it's not going to be quite as simple, I guess.
No.
So kind of on that kind of similar theme of ways to prevent the spread of squirrelpox, Dave Anderson has said some of this must be due to pine marten expansion in central Scotland rather than grey squirrel control, which has been patchy. So natural control of greys by pine marten must be the greatest influence on preventing the spread of the virus. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I think we'll hear over the next couple of days. I think we'll hear more from Emma Sheehy about pine martens and their relationship with red and grey squirrels. And from her, without preempt what she's saying, it's clear from from the work that they've done that the presence of pine martens can cause a grey squirrel population to completely crash. And we do know that there are pine martens as close into places like Falkirk and Cumbernauld, where they've been spotted and pictures have been taken on camera, and the surveys are showing that they are quite close in. So they are actually in some of these areas where we would have expected the disease to be rampant, go rampaging through the central lowlands. It may be exactly that the pine martens are able to keep the grey squirrel populations lower than we were expecting. And pine martens haven't been built into the modelling work that we've done. So be interesting to do that if we could get modelling work done that included the effect of pine martens in the mix. But that is a possibility that it could be pine martens that's making the difference. And we know from the work in places like the Tweed Valley where there is the red squirrels, grey squirrels, pine martens, and squirrelpox, we know that the more pine martens are present, the less squirrelpox you find in the grey squirrels. So, and then obviously the less you find in red squirrels. But having said that, we still do get the occasional red squirrel diseased in the Tweed Valley, nonetheless. So it still does happen. But it just keeps the balance between the two species more in the red squirrel's favour than otherwise.
Okay, just going through these questions here. So another one from Hugh. He's talking about when reds were reintroduced to Cornwall and they were kept in a big acclimatization cage, and the greys were sitting on the cage, but reds only got infected once they were released. So I guess he's asking, does it need to be physical contact, like for example biting or rubbing up against each other, that would actually cause squirrelpox to spread from a grey to a red?
Perhaps I can say something about that. I mean, it's another of these things we don't know for sure, but there's probably the possibility that it's within the environment, that if the red is coming into contact with areas where the grey has been in contact as well, it's transferring that way. Although I guess there's a potential for direct contact fighting, that sort of thing. But I think it's more likely that in the majority of cases, it's going through contact with something they've been in contact with, if you see what I mean, rubbing against the same branch or, whatever it is, and transferring the virus that way.
Yeah, which is what Mary-Anne, you were talking about with why we ask people to bring feeders in when we have a suspected outbreak.
Yeah, just try and overlap those areas that they could be sharing, just to make sure there's a bit more of a separation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
One of the things they found at Liverpool University in the study was that grey squirrels tended to shed the virus from scent patches on their wrists. So you'll notice squirrels have whiskers on their wrists that are near where their scent patches are, and they do deliberately scent mark with these patches. So it may be that as they're scent marking, they're wiping virus, not meaning to, but obviously wiping virus unintentionally onto places that maybe red squirrels later come along and sniff and also rub their scent glands against. So it may be something like that, but I have to say we don't know. This is just speculation as to how it might happen. But I think at the moment the thinking is probably along the lines of what Elspeth said, is that it's the virus is left by one squirrel and picked up later, probably not very much later, but later by another squirrel.
Okay, thanks. Well, we're kind of coming to the end now. I can see that there's a couple of questions in there which are quite specific about the Tayside area and testing and stuff. I think what we'll do is we'll keep those questions and we'll pass them on to Anne-Marie, who couldn't be here tonight, so that you can get direct answers to those. I think we'll just end on the very last question from Jeremy, who says, does the possible link with Pine Martin suggest we should all put out more raspberry sandwiches at night? I think that sounds like a good idea.
Well, that and Pine Marten den boxes. One of the big things that limits Pine Martens taking up residence in a piece of woodland is if it's conifers, there aren't a lot of good denning sites. So they like hollow trees if they can get them. So, but you can get artificial den boxes. So, although you might have to have a license to do that. So don't just go out and do it. Find out a little bit about it first before you do it. Dave Anderson, who asked a question earlier, will probably be able to tell you.
Okay, but you definitely don't need a license to put out raspberry sandwiches. So yes, go ahead with that if you want to. Okay, I think that's all we have time for because we've reached, that's 8:30 now. So what I'll say is if you do have any more questions or if you think of anything after the event, please do get in touch. You can either get in touch with your local conservation officer, or you can just get in touch with the project in general. Our email is squirrels@scottishwildlifetrust.org.uk. There's also an information toolkit which was emailed out probably to everybody on here a couple of months ago. If you've got a copy of that, great. If not, it's available on our website under the publications page. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're recording this so that it's available to rewatch at tomorrow's Knowledge Fair, which is on CrowdCom. So it's our kind of end of project conference. It's a 2-day online event. There's going to be lots of talks from the SSRS team and the wider SSRS community, so people like landowners and volunteers and so on. And then we've also got talks from people from the wider red squirrel conservation and research community. So if you've registered for that, please do get signed up on CrowdComs. You should have got an email about it today. If you don't know anything about this and you're not signed up and you want to join tomorrow or Saturday, probably at this late stage, the best thing to do would be to send the project a direct email, and I'll do my best to get you signed up in time for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. But I think that's all we have time for. So just thank you so much to all our speakers, especially Elspeth, for taking time out to join us today. It's been really valuable, such interesting talks and really insightful. So thank you very much. And if you do want to rewatch this, as I said, it's going to be available on CrowdComs tomorrow. So I think that's all. Just have a good evening. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.